Hi, I'm Chef Jennifer Cabillos, and today we're going to be making fudge. Fudge is a crystalline sugar confection, which means that sugar wants to form crystals. We're going to intentionally form a specific size of crystal in this, and that's what's going to help thicken the product and make it the right consistency. So we need to be very careful not to crystallize until we're ready, that we have an appropriate seed, which is the crystal we add in to mimic that, so it'll mimic that size of crystal, which is going to be from our confectionery fondant, and that we're paying really close attention to our temperature. Temperature in confections is everything, so you want to have a really good thermometer. I have a ThermoWorks digital thermometer. It's really great when you can have the heat alarm so that when it gets close to your temperature, it kind of goes off. It allows you a little bit more time and motion around the kitchen, so you're not just staring at your thermometer the entire time. But I have all my ingredients already scaled here. We're gonna be cooking, and usually with fudge, there's dairy product that's added in the beginning. When we're cooking sugar, usually we don't wanna stir at all. But when we have the presence of the proteins in dairy, those can scorch. So in that case, the fat from that dairy is going to help prevent crystallization, and we're going to be stirring consistently the whole time so that we don't scorch the proteins in that dairy. We just want them to start to brown and form a Maillard reaction that creates a really nice nutty and slightly bitter flavor that really goes well with the chocolate. So we're going to get started. Here I have my composite stone table. You can use a small marble slab, but this is going to be the surface area where I'm going to make my fudge. So I'm going to gently clean it, and I just have a little bit of white vinegar to clean off any impurities first. This is going to help make sure that this is a nice clean place for me to make my candy. And then, so that it doesn't stick too much, I have a little bit of oil here, some grapeseed oil. I don't need a whole lot. I'm just going to put a little bit onto my paper. And this is just going to help this keep this from sticking so thoroughly. And I want to get this space ready before I start cooking my candy. That way I don't forget this step, and I don't have my sugar cooling in my pot when it should be cooling on my stone. We like to use stone for this because it better evenly distributes the heat. So we always want to have a stone working place. This is a granite composite, but like I said, you can use a marble slab as well. These are metal bars. They're often called caramel rails, or caramel rulers, or confectionery bars. They're just made out of aluminum, really easy to clean. You can see usually they have two different measurements. The short side is 3/8 of an inch, and our long side is 3/4 of an inch, but they come in many different sizes. The purpose of these is that we can make ourselves a custom frame for which to put our candy in. So if we were making something that we wanted to be thicker, like fudge or marshmallows, we could set them up like this, level it off really easily, and then have exactly 3/4 of an inch high fudge or marshmallow. If we want to do something thinner, like a patafouille, we can simply lay them down like this and have 3/8 of an inch tall candy, and use this to completely and smoothly level whatever we're working on. The nice thing about these as well is that they're adjustable, so if I make a smaller batch, I can simply move the bars in. If I make a larger batch, I can move them out, and they come in tiny and giant sizes. So I want to get these set up for whatever I'm working on, make sure they're on the appropriate side for the height that I want. I usually start with them smaller, and then if I have a larger batch, I adjust these going in or out for however much space that I need. So we're going to start by adding our dairy to our pot. In this case, that's going to be milk and cream. And all the measurements for this and the recipe will be in the comments section below. So I have my milk and my 40% cream, which make up the liquid. I always want to put my liquid in first. When we talk about seed is any sugar crystals that can be added that might be dry and start to cause the rest of your crystal structure to crystallize. So what we want is to prevent any dry crystals. So a lot of recipes will tell you to add your sugar and then stir it to dissolve. I find that as long as you add the sugar directly to the center, then you don't have any issues. But we're gonna start off, we're gonna add our sugar very last. This is glucose. It's half of the molecule that makes up sucrose, which is sugar. This adds elasticity to our product, and it's a doctor which helps prevent crystallization. So I like to weigh it into these little plastic bags because it's very sticky, and I can just pop that and then squeeze it right into my product without getting it all over me or having it stick to anything else that I'm working on, or try and stay in the container that I weighed it into. Then I have my invert sugar. Invert sugar, like glucose, is similar to glucose. This is actually glucose and fructose, the two molecules that make up sucrose or sugar, but they've been hydrolyzed, which means that they've been treated with acid, which severs the bonds. So now they're independent of each other. And both this and the glucose act as doctors to interrupt the formation of crystals, which is a really important part of this process. Now that we have our liquid and our doctors in here, we're gonna take our sugar and we're gonna pour it straight into the center, being very careful that it's in one slow motion into the center. I don't wanna get little dry crystal granules on the sides. And you can see that the sugar is starting to absorb and be hydrated by that liquid. If I dump this in too quickly, it won't fully hydrate. So you can see the dry crystals on top, and you can see where they're darker and they're becoming hydrated. What I want to do before turning my heat on is just start to move this around and make sure that there's no dry sugar crystals. And you can see by doing this, by moving just from the center, I'm preventing any sugar crystals from sticking to the side of my pot that might become seed later. So this way I don't have to stir this, agitate it, and potentially cause a risk of crystallization. Now I'm going to turn my heat on to medium-high heat. And because I have dairy in here, I want to continuously stir, when usually I wouldn't be stirring at all. I'm going to cook this to 239 degrees. Crystalline candies are usually cooked to a fairly low temperature because at a high temperature, they're at a larger risk for crystallization. So I will need to use my thermometer to gauge the temperature, but I know that this is going to boil at 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So I'm going to wait until it's boiling before I add my thermometer, which is just going to be another thing to kind of get in the way. Just stirring continually, making sure that I grab those edges every once in a while so it doesn't start to burn around the edges. You can see I'm using a fairly large pot here because I'm stirring this and it has all that fat present. It's going to boil kind of furiously, just like if you've ever made caramel sauce and you add cream to it, it bubbles up really high. So we want to make sure we have a pot with high enough sides that it's not going to boil over during the cooking process and make a mess everywhere. You can see on my thermometer probe that there's a little dimple right here, and this needs to be fully submerged in order to take the temperature. Right now, this is not deep enough for me to take that temperature. So when I'm taking my temperature, I need to make sure that I'm tilting my pot so I can fully submerge the dimple to get an accurate reading. Also, I want to make sure that the tip of this is not hitting the bottom of my pot. Then it will read the temperature of the metal pot and not the temperature of what I'm reading. So the dimple needs to be fully submerged, but not touching the pot whenever we are taking the temperature. So now that I've hit 239 degrees, you can see I have a nice caramelly color. I'm going to pour this directly onto my marble. Technically not marble, but onto my stone. Be very careful because this is very hot. And if you touch it, it will burn you significantly. So at this point, we're going to allow this to cool. This should not be crystallized yet. It shouldn't be chunky or gritty at all. The crystals will happen once we add in our other ingredients. We're going to let this cool to 120 degrees Fahrenheit. But while it's cooling, we're going to add our other ingredients on top. So I can add my vanilla. My fondant, which is going to act as my seed to tell the fudge what size crystals to make. Fondant is actually just a super saturated sugar solution, which means that it has more sugar than can be dissolved at room temperature. And it has very, very fine crystals. So it's gonna make my fudge create very, very fine crystals. And then finally, since this is chocolate fudge, I'm gonna add my chocolate liqueur on top. I can take my thermometer, and I'm just going to place this right in the middle, making sure I kind of bury the tip of it so I can check on the temperature. And it's going to drop fairly quickly now that it's spread out on a cool surface. It's going to cool faster on the edges than it will in the center. So you can actually start to kind of push this up and into the center. You can use a bench blade to do this. I like to use a taping knife. It's going to be very sticky. And this way we're placing the cooler bits back into the center where it's warmer, and the warm center can kind of ooze out to the outside to cool a little more evenly. We don't necessarily want to agitate this. We're just bringing those edges in. And I'm already down to 120 degrees that quickly. So now I'm going to start to work this together. I really want to make sure that I get that fondant mixed up. So I'm going to start to chop at the fondant in the center. You'll see your chocolate melting in and thickening it that way. I'm just going to use this and spread it so that I really don't want to end up with any fondant or chocolate chunks left over. So I want to make sure that this gets completely mixed. And this stirring with the seed of the fondant is causing crystallization. That's what's going to cause this to thicken. So I'm going to spread it out. And then I'm going to bring it back together. Now that it's mostly combined, if you're going to add any inclusions such as nuts or dried fruit, you can add almost any dried item to this. You could add seeds in here if you wanted to. You could even add spices. But that's what I can start to add at this point. So I have some toasted hazelnuts and some chopped dried cherries. And I want to start adding that in before this is done. Otherwise, if I add it when my fudge is ready, it'll be too thick and I won't be able to get it properly mixed in. So I pull it all into the center and then I spread it back out. Make sure that you're scraping all the way down to the stone. Otherwise, the section that stays on the table will get over crystallized and it won't want to mix back into your fudge. This is going to take approximately 8 to 10 minutes of total mixing time from when you started. And you should be seeing the texture change more and more. It's going to get thicker and thicker. It's going to fight you more and more as you go along. But if you don't agitate properly, you won't get crystallization and this will stay a really sticky mass and it won't become a nice solid fudge that you can cut with a knife. So I can take my fudge and I've scraped it up onto my taping knife and I'm just going to deposit it into these rails. I feel like it's going to take up a good amount of space, so I can go ahead and spread this out. Okay, now that it's all here, I want to hold my rails in place while I gently spread this. It's going to be very sticky and definitely try to fight you a little bit. Okay, so if you want this to have a really rustic look, you can have it piled up on top of your candy bars or rails like this. If you want to have really nice, precise squares for doing mignardises or anything really fancy like that, you're going to want to remove any excess and have these completely nice and level. So I'm just going to use the top of the bars as a guide to make this level with my rails. So I'm just scraping, pushing right down on those rails, pulling excess off the top. Now that I have it more or less even, I can come back and adjust the top so that it's nice and level. I don't have an infinite amount of time to work with this, but as it starts to set, which you can see it thickening more and more and more, becoming less and less shiny, I can use that thickness to help me spread it nice and smooth. I brought a roll of another half sheet silpat in here. Oh, they're right there. Can you grab me one of those? And if I want to make sure that it's really flat, I can take another silpat, lay it on top like this, and then press it completely smooth. With my other silpat. Once this is started to chill, I can pull this off once it's solid and then allow it to continue to cure. And I can actually use a rolling pin and pressing right down on top of the rails, get it nice and perfectly smooth. I'm just going to allow this to crystallize because crystals will continue to grow even after the mixing process. So this is quite soft right now. It will continue to thicken over time. So we'll allow it to thicken for at least an hour, but up to overnight before cutting and finishing. It's been crystallizing in the frames for about an hour and a half, and so now I can begin cutting my fudge. I'm going to start by making 2 straight edges. I want to get nice, perfect squares, especially I'm going to be using this as a form of pedophore instead of a more rustic loaf. So I'm just going to cut 2 really nice, smooth edges. Just cutting off as little as I can to get a straight edge. Now I'm going to take my ruler and I'm going to go ahead and mark this entire thing. I'm going to cut small 1x1 squares because this is very sweet and very rich. And so a large piece isn't really necessary. So I'm going to mark it at 1 inch. And I'm going along the smooth cut side, marking each way. Now I'm going to mark my uncut sides when I want to move from the cut side to the other side. If I start in this corner, my marks aren't going to line up. So I need to make sure that I start where I started on the opposite side. So once again, marking 1 inch pieces, nice and small. Small, tiny bites. That's what we're looking for. And then I started here and I moved across, so I'm going to start here on this side, making sure that those pieces are going to line up nice and pretty. So now that I have that all marked out, I can kind of draw my line across it like this. And I always like to mark all the way across before cutting through, because it gives me an opportunity to check and make sure I haven't made any errors, that I have nice sharp corners, everything is lined up appropriately. So now that I'll be cutting through the fudge, I want to make sure I wipe my knife off after every cut. And this is going to ensure that I have nice, beautiful edges and that all of this doesn't drag through the next cut. Now I can turn it, making sure to line all those lines back up. Another nice reason to mark the entire top. I'm I want to make sure that I'm holding my knife straight up and down and not cutting to the side like this or like this, but completely perpendicular with the cutting board. When we're talking about pedophores or small confections, the key to the value of these is really the detail and the delicacy of the presentation. So even if we make a really delicious fudge, if it doesn't have that elevated presentation, it's going to be worth less than if we take a little extra time to make sure that all of our cuts are nice and perfect. So now you can see we have nice, beautiful, identical squares. You can see that cherry and the hazelnut. You can see that cherry and the hazelnut there from the side. All of these are even in lining up. And traditionally we would be plattering these for some form of presentation with a nice garnish on top of them. Adding a garnish can really bring a contrast to our confections. Nicely made fudge should hold up firm on its own. It should have evenly distributed inclusions, which means that you can see that we have both cherries and hazelnuts here. It shouldn't be too firm or dry, but it should be really easy to break and nice and smooth in the interior.